15th, 2022 Rolling Knolls CAG meeting. And the first segment here are introductions and purpose. Tonight's meeting will be a combination of sort of catching up on work that's been going on over the last, at this point, it's been 8 months since the last CAG meeting. And so there are a number of items where we're sort of filling in various pieces that they're not all the same. They're not all from the same work product. So we'll hear from the technical advisors regarding the landfill comparison evaluation. We'll hear a brief update from Fish and Wildlife Service on the data gaps investigation. And we will just sort of recap for everybody a memorandum of understanding that was executed in July of this past year regarding the Rolling Knolls landfill site. And in terms of future meeting topics, we know that the next meeting will be on March 29th. And we're soliciting ideas for that meeting, potentially another meeting in the next maybe 2 months out. So we're expecting that there will be more regular CAG meetings over the next few months. And I think one of the items that for a future meeting topic was whether or not the potentially responsible parties group would like to make a presentation at the meeting. And so Rich or Mickey, if either of you have any idea of whether you'd want to make a presentation at the next meeting or the 2 meetings out, you can let us know.
Yeah, Matt, I'm assuming that March 29th will be completely taken with what we've already got on the agenda. And if the PRPs make a presentation, it would be the subsequent one.
Yep.
But we would need to know what they want to talk about and make sure the CAG is in support of that.
Yep. Okay. So if you have anything to say about that now, feel free. Otherwise, we'll touch base later. And I think, Sally, if it's okay with you, I think it's time to move on to our first agenda item.
Yeah, perfect timing, 6:15.
Okay, and so we have Fran Schultz and Robert Blauvelt to present the landfill comparison evaluation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you. Fran, are you up first?
Bob's up first.
All right, Bob, it's all you.
Okay.
Did I make Bob a co-host? Bob, do you need to share your screen?
No, Fran is
Okay.
going to be doing most of that.
Okay, all right, you're a co-host. I think you're a co-host anyway, if you wanted to.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, thank everybody for attending today and appreciate your time. And our presentation, which will last about 15 or 20 minutes, is based on a challenge that Sally threw at us. We have, over the last several months, been researching the other municipal Superfund landfill sites in Region 2 EPA, which Region 2 is New York and New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the US VI. We focused on, we initially started comparing how closures were done at those other municipal Superfund sites, municipal landfill Superfund sites. And we had come up with a pretty generic approach, and Sally challenged us to make it more quantitative. How can we actually demonstrate in a quantitative manner the differences between the PRP's proposed remedial options, those are 3 and 4, essentially the ones we looked at, and evaluate them numerically, score them, if you will, in comparison to other similar landfills, municipal Superfund site landfills in Region 2, and the closure requirements that EPA has mandated for those other sites. And so with that challenge, we went off to think about it, and Fran in a minute will present the results of her good work in answering that. But we did create, and I'll briefly summarize it. We did create a numerical scoring system, a ranking system, if you will, that's based on a number of criteria that seem to be pretty universal across Region 2 for these types of sites, for the closure requirements for these types of sites. And we scored those criteria. Again, Fran will describe all that. And then at the end of the day, compared options 3 and 4 of the PRPs to how, to the numerical rankings, the scoring, if you will, of other similar sites. Now, each site is different. Each site has its own set of technical drivers and limitations, but in general, we've come up with, we think, is a pretty representative look as to how most of these sites are being closed or have been closed. Now, this may be, for those of you that aren't used to looking at spreadsheets and thinking about descriptive phrases in terms of numbers, just hang in there with us. Fran will try her best to explain it, and we will have plenty of time for some Q&As at the end of this to try to describe the process. But the intent here is to compare remedial options 3 and 4 that the PRPs are considering, and how the work to be done under those 2 options stacks up against other municipal landfill Superfund sites in Region 2, and what those closure requirements were. So with that, Fran?
Okay, so I'm going to start to orient you about how this numbering system, the scoring system works. I'm going to start with Rolling Knolls landfill, because that's our benchmark. So the first category is to determine whether sites are smaller or larger or the same size as Rolling Knolls. And we did that based on, is it more than 20% larger or smaller? So obviously Rolling Knolls is the same size as itself, so it gets the minimum score, because we're looking for the lowest score, meaning the ones that are going to be most like Rolling Knolls. So obviously Rolling Knolls has to have the lowest score. And then we looked at various remediation components like the cap type, the fencing, landfill gas management, leachate management, waste relocation. And so we broke out what EPA calls consolidation into waste relocation and area reduction and waste compaction. So for purposes of that gets broken into 2 categories. And so we've said that for Rolling Knolls, it will have an impermeable cap, which is what we've been talking about. It will have a fence around it. It will not have landfill gas management, or at least we don't know about that yet. It will not have leachate management, or we don't know whether or not it will yet. It will not have waste relocation, at least that's what we've been talking about, and that they will not be compacting the waste to take up a smaller volume or be more dense. And then the next series of questions was, how does what's being proposed compared to the New Jersey Legacy Landfill Act or the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation inactive landfill requirements? And we found that none of those were specifically listed in the RODs. It did not say you must comply with this state's requirements for blah, blah, blah. What it does say, though, is that the individual requirements are rolled into the requirements of the ROD, meaning that if the New Jersey Legacy Landfill Act says you're going to have leachate management, then leachate management will be in the ROD. There are some places where that's not included. And the other thing that we included was what was the remediation cost per acre of landfill, to the best that we could determine, whether it was 20% less or 20% more than the estimated costs for the options 3 and 4 that EPA had presented in the feasibility study. And then the last two groupings were whether or not they're going to have institutional controls, things like a deed notice and a groundwater classification exception area, and whether remediation included non-hazardous components, such as dealing with leachate or trash. So those were the criteria that we established, and we gave each one a rating, one being the most like what Rolling Knolls is, 2 being the opposite of it. And there's only a couple of cases where we had a third choice because there were some places that had both a permeable and an impermeable cap over different parts of the landfill, or where they the costs were significantly different. So that said, we reviewed all the landfills that we had previously listed and translated all the criteria that we'd looked at into this number ranking system. And we found that the Kinbuck landfill was the least like the plan for Rolling Knolls, in the sense that it was smaller. It had a impermeable cap. It had no fence, no landfill gas management, no leachate management, no waste relocation, and a little bit of compaction. And so you can see in almost every way, it was different than what Rolling Knolls has now. Now, that doesn't necessarily for the deed notice of CEA.
Fran, I'm sorry, are you sharing that screen, the summary screen?
That's what they said. Josie said
I only see the rating listing.
The ratings listings.
Yeah, rating.
That's what I'm reading from.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
But that Rolling Knolls does not currently have a deed notice in CEA, but it probably will eventually. So it will become a little bit more like Kenbuck. The one that's most like North Sea, like what we think Rolling Knolls will be, is North Sea landfill, which is in New York. And that one came very close to what we think is going to be for Rolling Knolls. It had a permeable cap. It has a fence. It has landfill gas management, no leachate management, no waste relocation, no waste compaction. It is not compliant with the New York State legacy inactive landfill requirements, and it has a slightly lower cost per acre for remediation. So that's kind of gives you an orientation of how you can read this table. And some interesting trends that came out of it is most of the sites were smaller than Rolling Knolls. There were an equal number of sites with permeable versus impermeable caps. All but 2 sites had fences. All but 3 sites had landfill gas management systems. Most of them had leachate management systems. There were approximately an even number of sites that had waste reduction or relocation. Most of the sites incorporated waste compaction in some form. Most of the sites met the criteria for New Jersey's Legacy Landfill Act or New Jersey's Inactive Landfill Act initiative, but those were not explicitly called out in the ROD. Most sites cost more per acre than the feasibility study cost for options 3 or 4. And most of the sites included addressing leachate or other non-hazardous materials in the ROD. That was a brain dump, but I'm open to any questions or as much time as people want to look at this. Assuming you can see it.
Fran, what about addressing groundwater?
So we did not break out groundwater expressly. The only place where that shows up is in the presence of a CEA. Let me go back to, this is the more complete version that gives you more of the details. And groundwater remediation was not necessarily included in this. We were focusing on the capping and type and things like that. But I can tell you from my experience in reviewing these files, having groundwater separated out as a separate either operating unit or addressed completely separately was fairly uncommon.
Fran,
So
I want to draw your, oh, sorry, there was a question in the chat wanting to know where you got the information for the analysis.
So all of this information came from the EPA websites for each site. So on the EPA website, you can go and find each one of these landfills, and you can find documents for each landfill, including the ROD and the 5-year status reports. And frequently we found more in the 5-year report because that's after the construction is complete. So we were pulling information from the ROD, from the and from those 5-year reports.
Okay, Fran, I'm going to ask, I guess maybe if you wouldn't mind repeating yourself a bit. 2 things in what you analyzed that were very important to me, and I believe the CAG, were the issue of consolidation and the issue of compliance with the Legacy Landfill Act. Could you just summarize again how that turned out in your analysis? Most of them X or most of them Y, and if there were any reasons for any differences.
Sure. So 13 of the sites had, 13 out of 23 sites had waste reduction or relocation, meaning they either, and then reduction might mean that they moved it into a smaller area. Relocation would mean they moved it from one place to another. And most of the sites had compaction, and I don't have the actual numbers, but it meant that means more than 50%. As far as the legacy landfill and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation inactive landfill requirements, they have very specific, the states both have similar but very specific requirements, such as permeable caps, landfill gas management, leachate management, sampling for emergent contaminants for New York is one of their requirements. So these requirements may be written into the ROD, but they're not specifically referred to as being the New Jersey Legacy Landfill Act or New York, the New York Inactive Landfill Initiative. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. Yes.
Okay,
Hey, do you mind if I chime in?
go ahead.
So it's John Prince from EPA. This is a really, really difficult task that you've taken on. So I applaud you for the effort. There's a reason why EPA does not spend a lot of time lining up sites and comparing them like this, because A, it's really, really hard to do, and B, the sources of data, as you Fran are finding are sometimes EPA isn't necessarily writing a document, even a 5-year review, to help Fran fill out this level of analysis. So it's very challenging. And I've been around long enough to be associated with almost all of these cleanups in one way or another, some of them quite very, very closely, such as Kimbuk, and others that were, decisions that were made in the 80s or the 90s and remedies that were implemented 20 years ago that I'm not sure how comparable they really are to what we're dealing with today. There are some things, Fran, that I just know are not correct, but I'm not sure if it's worth the time to correct any particular things about any particular site, because I don't think that's your point, is to try and get a perfect analysis. You're trying to give the CAG some framing, right? So I'll just, my natural inclination is to list all sorts of things that you've said just now that I just happen to know are not correct. But I'm not sure that would help. But I did want to, Sally, speak to one item about these sites in your question or Fran's analysis of, in particular, the legacy landfill law. That is so new that none of these sites would have referenced it. It just hadn't been around. Now the site has, the state has closure regulations for municipal landfills, right? That's a different, that might be another category that we might have considered.
That's different than the legacy landfill?
Yes, absolutely. The Legacy Landfill Act is meant to capture a certain tranche of sites that frankly look a lot like this one, that are kind of the trail between when the waste was put there and its current activity is long broken. And by that I mean right next to Kimbuk in Edison, New Jersey, is the Edison Township landfill. I also know a lot about that, even though it's not an MPL site. And it is a really big, really tall municipal landfill that's right on the Raritan River in Middlesex County, in what is not humorously called the Valley of the Landfills, and is subject to a closure plan by the state of New Jersey being implemented slowly over decades by Edison Township. And because it was Edison Township's landfill, New Jersey actually allowed them to keep it open so that they could get enough tipping fees so they could have the money to do the closure, right? And that's how those state of New Jersey regs presumed things were gonna happen. There was no tipping fees collected to close it here, right? There's no connection back to the original pot of money that today we would set aside to make sure that the landfills close properly. So that whole part of how this would normally happen can't really happen here. So so that's why you're not going to find any reference to that particular law here in any of these sites. Yeah, so I don't want to, Fran, I don't think you did this for EPA. You were more doing it for the group. So I don't want to, add my commentary on it. I did want to at least give a little bit of perspective that this task is really, really hard, and it is really hard, I'm sure there was something in the documents that suggested that Kimbuk was 6 acres. It's much, much bigger than 6 acres, right?
Right.
It just is, right? And it's got a fence around it and a leachate collection system and a gas collection system. And it's got a RCRA subtitle C cap and a slurry wall that's 80 feet deep, right? It's a,
Which are not mentioned in any of those documents.
because that's what it took to actually close it and stop it from leaking into the Red River, which it did for a long time. So it's very, very difficult to say anything that compares Kimbuk, for instance, or Lipari to
Well, John,
Rolling Knolls.
I'd suggest that this table is the minimum. I don't think, as you indicated with Kimbuk, is that if during actual closure more stuff was done, I don't think it takes away the framing value that our comparison has provided.
Yeah, and again, I think there's some value maybe for, I don't think you did this for us, right? I think you did it for the community members, for the CAG members, to help them get some idea what's out there. So I don't want to comment on that.
And more to give people a way of visualizing the criteria that we're evaluating instead of a big ugly table that's very hard to interpret, to be honest.
John, I think your comment was pretty accurate. This was not done to demonstrate anything to EPA. We know you guys know exactly what's going on at all of these Superfund sites and would never want to imply otherwise. It was indeed originally for me and then for the CAG to understand how other somewhat comparable landfills are handled. So I found it very useful. I hope when people have a chance to kind of look at it, they will as well. Fran and or Bob, I don't even recall if we discussed this or if you know the answer to my next question. I presume John Prince certainly will. Do we know the ultimate use or the, what's the phrase, the reasonably intended future use of any of these comparable landfills as, versus Rolling Knolls?
So I can answer for what we did. You had asked me about that, and I added a column, which is the circles kind of on the left-hand side that are green and orange and blue, that indicate, from what I was able to see in the publicly available documents, what it said about how what it said about the use of the site, the current use of those sites. And they ranged from recreational in some cases. And let's see if I can make my screen a little bigger so that you can see at least the legend for the colors. A lot of them are just listed as O&M, ongoing operations and maintenance, no access, possibly redeveloped, status unknown. So that's the majority of them. And then there were some that have been mixed use, commercial, industrial, and several have been modified for solar. So that's what the different colors are. I think it's only one or two. One that was just made a solar farm. That's Prince Landfill, Price.
Price is there.
I keep
Yeah,
forgetting whether it's Price or
there's a
Prince.
couple. Kimbuk actually has a solar farm now too.
Yeah.
But
a lot of them are just listed as
that
O&M.
came much later. Just, the remedy was concluded. Oh, what else might we do with this land? And in fact, the BRPs approached us and said, is this something where we could consider a solar farm based on the remedy that's finished. That's just as an example for Kimbuk. And we concluded that that was acceptable, and so that's what's there now.
How about the passive rec? Were any of them closed so that there could be passive recreation?
There are some that have recreation on them.
That's an even higher level, I
Yeah.
would guess.
So again, the, John,
We could,
John,
yeah, we could sort those by that category if you'd like, Sally. And
just the information available is not that specific. I mean, John's point is very well taken. If you go in and look at these documents, it's a little hard to tease this stuff out, and it's not all that specific. In some cases, it'll be quite specific. Part of the site is recreational, part of the site is commercial industrial, part of the site belongs to the municipality, and you may have all three in the same place. And those are ones that get mixed use. But frequently, it's pretty much just O&M.
but there are some that do have recreation, and again, we can sort those out and get you that list.
Like Peter Cooper, that's a pretty well-known site in recreational use.
Mhm.
So one of the, John, before you continue, one of the questions that I have for Fran and Sally and Bob is, ideally, this analysis provides a way for the CAG to have sort of a visual picture of, oh, if we look across all these different landfills, there's a variety of different ways that they're closed, and does that closure have some impact on future use? Is there, Bob and Fran, is there a key takeaway that you found in the evaluation that you think is worth discussing or taking into future discussions about the remedy or integrating the remedy and reuse at the Rolling Knoll site?
I think my takeaway is that the information that EPA puts on its website is not tailored to give us that information.
Well, to a certain extent, to a certain extent, the takeaway here, the principal takeaway here, is that the closure of these landfills is being done in a manner that ultimately allows for, in many cases, their reuse, that the closure of these sites is being done incorporating at a minimum many of the requirements of either the New Jersey Legacy Landfill Act or the New York State Inactive Landfill Initiative, primarily because those requirements were developed by EPA back in the 80s, back in the 70s. This is how you close a landfill, municipal or not. And it's been carried over through the practice, through the profession ever since. I mean, it's not like the state of New Jersey came up with these great ideas. These are EPA guidance documents that are as old as the department itself, as old as the agency itself. So that I think the takeaway here is, let's look at these landfills. Let's look how they're closed. Let's look what their end use is, and let's compare it to what the PRPs are proposing for Rolling Knolls. And let's make a judgment as to whether or not that's appropriate and consistent and useful in that process. And that's what the intent of the analysis we did was. It's far from perfect, but it's good enough.
So now that we've had some sort of back and forth from the technical advisor and EPA, I want to open this up. We have about 10 more minutes left in this segment to the CAG to see if there are any questions.
A couple of people have posted either questions or comments into the chat. So Josie,
Okay.
could you go
So
through those?
let's go to Josie in the chat. Josie's gonna read the chat and let people speak if they need to.
So someone was wondering if John could address if or why the legacy landfill regulations are being considered in the case for this site for Rolling Knolls.
Donnie, that you still there?
Let me see.
Sorry, what was the question? Apologies.
So it's in
I
the
mean,
chat.
I'm
but
listening.
No.
I just
So-
didn't quite get it.
No worries.
Teacher caught you not listening, John.
I am in my office and I do have my, yes, my implements of work are surrounding me and I apologize.
There was a comment saying John was clear about why the landfill closure regulations don't apply to Rolling Knolls, but could he address if or why the legacy landfill regulations are being considered in our case?
Well, so set aside the legacy landfill law for the moment, because for some technical reasons, it probably doesn't apply here. We're analyzing, and I mean, the law says what it applies to, right? And among the things it says is, but not Superfund sites. So that means it's pretty blunt in the law. So question is, are there aspects of municipal, and then the other thing there's some questions that I have about this list. It doesn't include some sites that and Fran, you said municipal landfill. So these are not all municipal landfills. So I'm
No,
not
they are
quite
not.
sure how that, some of these are definitely hazardous waste landfills. So that's just a sort of it sounds like a term of art, but they're very, very different in terms of how they get addressed. So the question before us is, well, if Superfund is only gonna, if Superfund is brought to the table to address certain things like hazardous substances, and there are areas of the landfill that appear to don't rise to the level of having hazardous substances within them, to what degree does some other rule or overarching matter come into play, such as the state's own landfill closure regulations? And that's a discussion we've had with the state, and we continue to have. And it's possible that, and I think you guys are starting to see this maybe, that the way this may play out is that the EPA will make a decision. It's about what we cover. The state may conclude that there is another decision about what they cover. And those things might not lay exactly over each other for reasons that come out of what the site says. And frankly, there's another phase, which is that the trustees, including Fish and Wildlife Service, have some other duties as natural resource trustees that may bring something else to the table that EPA doesn't have anything to do with. It's not that's not within our purview at all. So, it's possible that the EPA is going to make a decision. DEP will need to make some further findings, and then NRD is another layer. And I've been working on these projects, some of these projects, for decades. Unfortunately, that's kind of how it happens, right? Sometimes you do one thing, later you do the next thing, eventually you put solar on it, right? And so I think a lot of people are waiting for EPA to take that first step. We think we're actually getting pretty close, and yeah, so I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but it's not cut and dried that just because the state has a set of regulations that apply to something called a municipal landfill, that's what we're dealing with here.
I have a couple of questions, Josie, before you go on to other unrelated questions, just to follow up on this with John. I know the EPA is saying that the Legacy Landfill Act doesn't apply, but I don't think the state necessarily agrees with you yet. And I don't know who wins between mommy and daddy, but I don't think that's clear cut. And I obviously don't pretend to know the answer, but I don't think that the state has agreed that their act doesn't apply. And then I apologize for not getting this clear, because it was one of the thousands of FOIA documents that I have looked at, but there was some letter from the state, something about soil and requiring like 300 days of access. It had to be cleaned up to a standard where you could have 300 days of access. And even if it wasn't a residential standard, there was still like 200 days of access. Am I making any sense whatsoever, or am I going to have to go back and through the thousands of documents and find that letter?
Sorry, that doesn't sound familiar.
The only thing that sounds familiar at all, Sally, is the number of days of access that were used in calculating the exposure scenarios for passive recreation.
That was something that Michael Syvek was talking about. This came from DEP, so I will unfortunately have to go back, and when I find that, I'll send that over to EPA and ask for an explanation. I'm sorry,
Understood. I wish that I could help you, because I'm sure you have piles and piles of things to look through.
Stephanie, I know you're right there. By any chance, do you remember what I'm talking about?
No, sorry, it's not ringing a bell. I was gonna say the same thing that Fran said, but you're not talking about the risk assessment. No.
No, this was from DEP, and I'll try to find it. Okay, I'm sorry, Josie, you can go on to whoever was up there next.
No worries, just a few comments. Julia says that Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island is destined to become a park with passive public use. She thinks that's an ideal comparison. Fran added to the chat, for the current use of sites, there is some information on the NYSDEC website about the current use of sites. And I did see someone during the course of that conversation raise their hand. If they would like to raise their hand again or unmute to ask their question, I think now would be an ideal time. I didn't catch their name.
It was Michael from my.
Hi, thank you.
Oh,
Yeah. Wait. Yeah, it's Michael Syvek with EPA. I'm the Human Health Risk Assessor on the site for EPA. And I had raised my hand when there was a conversation going on about the different future land use categories. And someone was reporting out that in their research of all of these various landfills, oftentimes the land use was designated as recreational. And I know here we have kind of a more specific definition of that. And I just want to caution again that as a risk assessor who's been doing this work since the mid-90s, categorical land use or descriptions of land use may have changed over time. And so a document in the 90s that identified land use as recreational may not just have described that as the same way as another site that had recreational land use as the designated future land use. So that's a pretty broad category, and it can include a lot of different kinds of activities, from things that are more active like bicycling or dirt bike riding, to things that are less active like hiking or bird watching. So just kind of keep that in mind as well as you're looking at some of these these older documents and how they describe future land use. The definition or lack of definition may have changed over time. Again, adding to yet another complexity in trying to look at these different landfills, because it was going really smoothly up until right now, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Looks like we have another Michael D with his hand raised. I think we're ready for you to unmute.
Sure. I think what John was saying before about answering my question is that the EPA is going to make their decisions based on the Superfund regulations. But I think he was hinting that we also can get the DEP to weigh in and also to require that things are done. And after that, Fish and Wildlife may even decide to do some more remediation. So it's sort of like I'm not sure if John, if that's what you were saying, that there's sort of a three-pronged approach here that, and I don't know if this is something we can talk about before you make your decision. Can we go after should the DEP come in with you? You know, how, or do you see this as three different steps in time?
Thank you, Michael. That's a really good question. And one thing that I've experienced at other sites when we're in this pre-decision phase is that many times it's a domino effect, right? And somebody has to go first, and the others are going to make their decisions based on what it's inevitably us, right? What EPA decides is kind of the minimum protective action that needs to happen at a place. And it might be substantial, it might not be substantial. It will be protective though, right? It's protective for our expectations of what the future uses are going to be. And that's a conversation we've been sort of going back and forth on, right? That this CAG has been exploring, and that's really kind of the point of this, right? So that you can have this dialogue, that we can hear it, and that the people who ultimately are at the table at the right time. You know what? One of the challenges here, to be perfectly frank, is some of those other sites, like, you know, comparing how big is Fresh Kills, 2,200 acres or something. So Fresh Kills is owned by the city. It was operated by the city. They've got hundreds of millions of dollars set aside for closing it and then building it. And then they have indicated, going back for some period of time, that they planned to reuse this land. And now, some years after the closure, if it's not complete, it's nearing completion. Now they're imagining what the next steps are, right? And so even there, it's kind of a stepwise thing where they didn't come out with the whole plan of what was going to happen at Fresh Kills at the beginning. But the city was there and it had money. And you know, one of the challenges here is some of these ideas might not be a good fit here, given the landowner or the expectations, some of those things. Expectations of the landowner.
So we do have another question in the chat. What happens if the participants in the CAG disagree with EPA on the outcome?
Of what? The outcome of the remedy?
We'll have to, maybe they can Either maybe they could raise their hand and unmute if they wanted to elaborate, or they can add more information to the chat.
Hi, I'm happy to, it was my question, Julia Summers. I live in Green Village. And I'm curious to know, I mean, if EPA decides that the best solution to this site is to fence it and the CAG disagrees, what happens?
So the process involves EPA presenting its plans for the site to the public, explaining why it made a particular finding, and it's, you know, the structure around that, which will include the feasibility study documents that some of us have been looking at, the risk assessment, all this discussion about land use and future plans. But then ultimately EPA is going to say, hey, this is what needs to happen. This is what we expect the remedy to look like. But before we select it, we are soliciting input from the community to get some sense of what the community's positions are. And I suspect, Julia, that there'll be many different. It won't be like, oh, well, the community wants this. And I suspect that many people, whatever our decision is going to be, many people will not be satisfied with it, and many people will be. So but our job is to then take in all those comments and review them before we make a decision.
And if DEP and EPA disagree, what happens then?
It's ultimately EPA's decision.
Okay, our way or the highway? Okay,
I didn't say that.
I did.
Supposed to be working for us.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat.
No, I don't see any other in the chat, Matt.
Okay. That was a good discussion to start us off. It looks like the next item we have is a brief update from Fish and Wildlife Service, and it looks like we have George Molnar back and joined on audio. So you've made it.
George is there, but he's asked me to share his presentation. Right, George?
Yeah, the internet connection here from the refuge is really bad this evening. So yeah, Sally, if you don't mind, I'll just say next slide or something, and you can just move forward. That's all. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Can everybody see that? Did I do it right?
Yes, we can see it, and we can hear you loud and clear, George.
Wow.
Great. It only took 10 minutes. Well, thank you, Sally, and good evening, everyone. Well, for those of you not familiar with the Rolling Knolls landfill, the refuge owns approximately 35 acres of the total 140 acre site. As many of you are aware, Fish and Wildlife conducted our own independent investigation on the refuge-owned portion of the site. So the plan is for our consultant to present those findings of the investigation in much more greater detail at the next CAG meeting. I believe it's March 29th. But we wanted to give a quick overview since the document summarizing the investigation was released to the public just a few weeks ago. So some of the slides and information presented here, some of you have seen or heard before, so I apologize for any redundancy. But before I get started, I'd just like to give a quick description of the photos here. The photo on the left is one of our consultants doing some sediment and surface water sampling. I believe that area was taken from one of our upstream locations. And that picture on the right is our same person there doing some pore water sampling in one of the many areas around the waste pile where there's groundwater daylighting, and there's lots of active leaching from the landfill, from the waste pile. Okay, next slide, please. Well, as many as you have known, the refuge has taken the position that the remedial investigation didn't quite adequately characterize contaminant issues on the refuge owned portion. We've identified several areas where we felt additional data was needed in order to get a better understanding of the extent of contamination on the refuge. And some of these included spatial gaps in surface soil and sediment sampling, limited some subsurface samples in the waste pile, the interface between the waste pile, surface water, and shallow groundwater, and other field-based observations that would suggest a more widespread disposal of non-municipal waste. Just going to this photo on the right here, this is just an example of what we were seeing throughout the refuge portion of the site. This is one of the many roadways that we brush hog through to gain access to our sample locations. As you can see, it's all covered in garbage and surface debris, and it's pretty much where that's fairly ubiquitous throughout. I know the topic has come up that the landfill is partially covered, but if you consider a cover made of garbage, that's pretty much what we're seeing out there. Next slide, please. Hit it one more time, Sally. There you go. So the investigation was funded through the Department of Interior's Central Hazardous Material Fund at a cost of around $750,000. In government, we all know sometimes things take a little bit of extra time. However, we wanted to expedite the process as not to delay the project from moving ahead. So for this project, from the time of securing funding and subcontracting, the study design, all those upfront supporting documents, the field work, and the final document, which was shared with all of you a few weeks ago, this was all accomplished in just over a year. Field work included the collection and analysis of soil, sediment, surface water, and pore water. Included was also the analysis of some geotechnical parameters to evaluate the suitability of on-site clay for use in landfill cap construction. And all the field work was wrapped up in May of last year. Next slide. So the goals of the investigation were to address data gaps through the collection and analysis of additional environmental media in areas identified where sufficient data was lacking, to gain a better understanding of the leaching potential of the landfill waste and the fate and transport of oxidation and reduction sensitive metals, collect geotechnical data with the intent to better inform and guide the selection of appropriate and protective remedy, collect other field-based observations about the nature of the landfill, such as the presence and distribution of drums and drum carcasses and other indicators of industrial waste disposal, and ultimately also to share the results with EPA and the PRP group with the intent to supplement existing data sets, and which will hopefully aid in the development of a protective remedial alternative. Next slide. So just really quick, this is a summary of the number of samples collected by media. This photo here, this is what the drillers were using to do all the subsurface borings. Here they're using an auger to collect samples for geotechnical analysis. Okay, next slide. Okay, so all throughout the site, there was visual evidence of widespread hazardous substances. There was mixed municipal industrial waste found throughout. There was some potential laboratory and hospital waste seen, electronics, piles of foam parts. In the one picture over here on the right at the top, you'll see a test tube. Somewhere in there, I believe there were some ampules. There were numerous drum carcasses observed throughout the refuge. And also just a lot of active releases of landfill leachate throughout the site. But we found that mostly along the eastern and southern portions of the waste pile coming onto the refuge. If you look at that picture over there on the bottom right, you'll notice that orange precipitate. That's due to the iron in the leachate coming into contact with the atmosphere and oxygenated environment. So you get that rust color. Okay, next. So for quick comparison purposes, I just wanted to show the distribution of soil samples across the site that were taken during the remedial investigation. Want to point out where the refuge boundary is. If you look at that figure, you'll see that orange line So the refuge lies to the east, to the south, and to the west of that line. That purple line illustrates where the approximate extent of the waste pile extends out to. Next, please. So this photo here is taken, this figure here is taken directly from our report. This is the location of our soil samples. We kept them all within the refuge. None of them were taken on the Million portion of the site. At each one of those little triangles, there was a surface soil sample collected and also a co-located subsurface sample. Those varied from either a composite sample of different depths, or in some instances, they were taken at discrete intervals. Those red circles are that you see on there are the locations of our geotechnical borings. Next. This figure, I apologize, it's very, very difficult to read. This was taken from the remedial investigation report. This is the locations of their surface water and sediment samples. Surface water samples are identified as beginning with an SW, sediment as an SD. Once again, you'll see where the refuge boundary is as noted by that orange line and the extent of the waste pile there. Okay, so next. And this is the location of our sediment samples. You see the little green font and little green dots. Next. So this is the locations of our surface water and pore water sample locations. Our pore water locations, if you could tell the difference on the font, our pore water locations are in that light blue font and our surface water ones were in that white. Once again, this figure is taken directly from our report. I wanted to focus a little bit on this. So the remedial investigation had a very, very limited number of pore water samples taken. We did a lot. We did, I think, about 47 pore water samples because we really wanted to get a very good understanding of that interface between the shallow groundwater and surface water. Conditions were really, really good at the time of collection. There was about 3 weeks of no rain. So crews were able to target and find these areas of seeps and see where there was some groundwater daylighting. So we have really good confidence that we were capturing true sediment pore water. Next, please. So what did we find? Well, results of our investigation indicate widespread contamination throughout the refuge-owned portion of the site. Several of the contaminants detected were found at levels that you wouldn't expect to find in just municipal waste. Specific ones that stand out are PCBs, lead, cadmium, and mercury. I think it's important to note mercury. In the remedial investigation, it was suggested that mercury contamination was mostly attributed to atmospheric deposition. We disagree with that, given the levels that were found. Levels of mercury associated with atmospheric deposition are typically seen at levels in parts per trillion, and we're seeing it in parts per million. So if you do your math, that's 1,000,000 times higher. Recently, there's been a lot of concern in the media about a group of chemicals known as PFAS. These chemicals are commonly found in landfills, but were never analyzed for in any previous investigations at the site. So we analyzed a subset of pore water samples, about 7 or 8 of them, and all of them tested positive for several PFAS compounds. The acid volatile sulfide simultaneously extractable metal data suggests bioavailability and toxicity of metals to benthic organisms. And of course, again, as you've seen on the other slides, we observed active releases of leachate as indicated by that orange muck. You can see that in the picture. This obviously isn't the tea-colored water you see in the pine barrens from tannins and bog iron. This is a thick, mucky flocculant, and it essentially smothers everything, making it nearly impossible to support anything that breathes with gills, such as invertebrates or tadpoles or salamander larvae or fish. Next, please.
George, before I go on, could you just translate something into English? That third bullet, the third bullet, blah, 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 data suggests bioavailability. Can you just translate that for me?
Sure, I'll do my best here. So what it is that's essentially is you take, there's the acid volatile sulfides and simultaneously extractable metals is, so you take a sediment sample, you run the analysis for sulfides. There's also a list of metals. I think it's, off the top of my head, I want to say it's about 6 or 7 metals. What you do is you would, the results of that, you would sum up and you would divide the concentration of your sulfides over your concentrations of metals. So if the ratio is equal or less than 1, it doesn't suggest bioavailability. Anything over 1 suggests that metals are bioavailable because they are not binding with any sulfides. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to go back to high school biology, I guess, but okay.
Yeah. There were numerous exceedances of screening criteria noted for all media. Geochemical analysis indicates conditions are favorable that facilitate the transports of contaminants within the leachate and also increase the mobility of metals. Results of the geotechnical evaluation indicate that the underlying clay is suitable for use in cap construction. Next. So another thing that we wanted to point out was throughout the remedial investigation and feasibility study, there's mention of hotspots, and they're often mentioned as points of interest or areas of concern. What our investigation has shown is that elevated levels of several constituents are fairly ubiquitous throughout the entire study area. These results, they fit really well with some of the field observations we made on the refuge, such as the evidence of widespread industrial waste disposal and some of the active leaching. For example, if you look at this figure, and again, this is a figure taken from our report, and I apologize for all the lines on it, but all those red triangles on there denote the locations of surface soil samples that exceeded screening criteria for PCBs and or dioxin. So if you look at that, I think there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 surface soil locations that were below those screening levels. Everything else was above. We saw similar trends in subsurface samples for PCBs. We also saw similar trends in metals. Okay, so next. This figure here was taken directly from the RI. We've used this before in some of our other presentations that we've given to the CAG. We superimposed some larger symbols to better illustrate the presence of PCBs and surface soils on the landfill, because that's what this figure is from. This is the PCB levels on the from the RI report. And as you can see, PCBs are pretty ubiquitous throughout the area, which is inconsistent with the claim that we've heard before that industrial waste and municipal waste is segregated at this landfill. It's, you know, we've seen it in our investigation. We saw it in the RI where it's pretty much commingled. So next, please. So data gaps addressed. Well, the short answer is yes. So we've seen both superficial and vertical extent of contamination is widespread. That's predominantly by heavy metals and PCBs. Identified numerous areas of active leaching is occurring onto the refuge, and the geochemical conditions present do play a considerable role in the transport and bioavailability of metals. And finally, there's widespread evidence of industrial waste disposal, drum carcasses, electronics, foam parts, and what appears to be hospital waste, just a whole bunch of stuff out there. And next. That's it.
I'm going to stop sharing to make it easier for people to see one another. I guess I can always go back to this if somebody wants to point something out.
All right. Before we jump in and open it up, so that was I think a preview of a longer presentation and discussion that we're planning to have next meeting on the data gaps analysis. Are there any questions about what George talked about? I think we have time for just a couple of quick questions at this point.
No questions yet in the chat, Matt. I think we do have one question. How deep were the subsoil samples?
Well, for geotechnical borings, and don't quote me on this, I don't have the report open in front of me. I believe the geotechnical borings went down to a depth of about 20 feet. For the chemistry borings, they went down. It varied, but they went down. I would say approximately around anywhere from about 10 to 15 feet.
George, could you touch on, or if you know, indicate what guidance was used in the collection of field samples of the soil and groundwater samples?
Sure. I mean, all the methods we used, they were your typical methods that are just used routinely for environmental investigations. We did generate a quality assurance project plan prior to conducting the field work that was reviewed by EPA and NJDEP. But a lot of these samples were collected following the appropriate protocol, and all the chemical analysis was following EPA standard methods.
Thank you.
We have another question here in the chat. You mentioned that part of the investigation was to determine if clay was present. What did you find?
Well, the short answer is yes. There's lots of clay out there. This was documented well before we went out there poking around. But we just wanted to confirm its presence, and more importantly, we wanted to confirm if the material there, that clay, if that is suitable for use in cap construction. We think that's it's going to help lower costs, and we think it's going to ultimately lead to less impacts to the community. I'm sure a lot of you that are participating in this call have heard this before.
So I think John Prince is going to address a question in the chat, which I'll just read out loud to everybody. For John, if this data is very different from what the EPA believes, will you reevaluate the remediation required? John?
So couple of things. It's a bit of a gloss in George's presentation. So I just want to make sure that I'm not going to go into any details, but the process that led to this work being done did involve EPA being provided with a quality assurance project plan, but it would normally take us quite a lot of time to review and approve such a thing, and we didn't want to hold up this work, so we didn't. I'm not condemning any of this work because of that, but I also don't want to give the impression that we somehow reviewed all their plans and endorsed them. We have looked through the data. It's my understanding that the PRP group was out filling one of the items identified in this report for a sort of a site-wide evaluation, and that are these ubiquitous PFAS compounds that are an emerging class of contaminants and very challenging for everyone in our fields to get a handle on. So that scope of sampling had not previously been done site-wide, and so the PRP group wanted to, I guess, check that box so that we had a better understanding of that. When this work kicked off, we indicated that more data is good, more data is helpful, and the refinement that we might typically do during the remedial design stage after the site remedy is selected would certainly require more data, and this data certainly is going to be useful for that purpose. I don't know that we're really seeing anything that's different than we have seen in the overall investigation. The one item that I'll just highlight for the group that it's a little hard to tease this out, so I'll just say it. We had originally expected that the remedy that we were going to select would be a single remedy for the entire site. That was the original plan. I think it was last year, we concluded that the nature of the groundwater data that was available didn't lead us to any actionable response action that we thought might be necessary, but there's certainly groundwater contamination in the shallow layer above this clay that George referenced. And that groundwater contamination probably is not well enough understood for us to go ahead with a decision on that part of the site. So we have indicated at previous meetings and the current expectation for the feasibility study that will be used to make a decision for the site is that the groundwater is actually being set aside and we're going to address it later. So some of what George is referring to and what he's talking about is actually some groundwater issues that that we'll have to tease out and be able to sort through in making a decision that doesn't include a decision about the ultimate fate of the groundwater.
Are there any questions for them from the CAG related to what John just said?
I think Julia has her hand raised.
Okay, we have time for one more question and then we're going to move on to the next topic.
Julia, can
Go
you
ahead,
unmute?
Julia.
Just unmute.
Here, I'll ask her to unmute. I'll send her a prompt. There we go.
I got it. Sorry, I'm slow. So you were saying that you will make a decision about groundwater after you make a decision about everything else? I'm sorry, did I understand
Yes.
that properly?
Yes, in other words, the decision we're making now is going to be about the contents of the landfill, soils, other things. But we're going to have a whole other separate decision-making phase for the groundwater. And my expectation is actually that we'll implement the soils remedy and monitor the groundwater before making monitor the consequences of doing that cleanup work before making some subsequent decision about the groundwater.
So the two will not be disconnected.
Excuse me? I think I understood you. Yes, the sites, the issues are not separate in that there is the reason that there's groundwater contamination beneath the waste is because it's coming from the waste, right? The degree to which it's going to go anywhere and has any consequence off the site does matter. And
Yeah, this is the headwaters of the Passaic River, which is a water source for millions of people. So yes.
right. And so we're not prepared to make a decision about the groundwater at the same time, because we want to see what the consequences of taking a soil action are. And if it's not enough, then other work would be necessary. Other cleanup work would be necessary.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the two are not disconnected and that one isn't leaving the other behind, because it's all part of the same picture. Downstream, this is all about public health, and in the refuge, it's all about the refuge health.
Thank
Matt,
you,
do we
Julia.
have
Thank you,
time
John.
for another question, or should we maybe save it towards the end when there'll be more time for Q&A?
Yeah, there's also going to be a whole other presentation at the end of
Yeah,
March
we're
that's going to focus on this. So we're not leaving
we're
this
not done
topic.
with this. I think we should move on to the other topic. There will be questions there too, and I want to save time for questions and CAG discussion on that, especially knowing that we have a whole meeting dedicated to this. Okay, so for the next topic, and that is the July 2021 MOU regarding the Rolling Knolls landfill. Sally and I discussed this, and we agreed. I'm going to give a brief overview of a few key things related to the MOU, and I'm going to give a sort of general assessment of how I think it's relevant to what we've been talking about. And then we're going to open it up to discussion. And I want there to be an opportunity for CAG members to weigh in, and I want there to be an opportunity for the agencies to weigh in. So
Matt, Mike Horn is also going to speak after you do, since you weren't in the room and he was.
Right, absolutely.
Context.
I wasn't in the room. I'm going to try to make it relevant to where we are with 30 minutes left in a meeting. So the MO, if I'll give a brief overview. The MOU is between the Miele Trust, the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, the Township of Chatham, and the Great Swamp Watershed Association. And a couple of the key components of the MOU are that the parties intend to evaluate and further negotiate ways of providing wildlife conservation and passive public recreation at the private portion of the site. And that those might be dedicated to open space, and that some of that evaluation might include appropriate future ownership, conservation, access easements, wildlife habitat management, recreational facility maintenance, as well as evaluation of what might be sources of funding to support those amenities and activities. There also is a resolution of the MOU that parties will work together and engage in negotiation to achieve use of the private portion of the site, generally along those lines. And that the remedy, that they will work together to achieve a remedy that will get there, that will get us there, that will get the parties there. So from my perspective, this memorandum comes about a month after a conversation that we had as a CAG about the future use of the refuge part of the site versus the private part of the site. And I know that that part of the discussion that we've had as a CAG has been about how whether or not the private portion of the site is going to be considered from a risk perspective publicly accessible land or not. We talked about, we heard that EPA's assumption going into this remedy without any other information is that that private land is going to continue to be private. And so an MOU that talks about evaluating future ownership changes, evaluating public access may have some bearing on how EPA looks at that. And I think then the other question is, how does this document fit into the agreements that are in place to guide the sort of implementation and selection and paying for of the remedy? And those are things that I think are relevant to some part of the discussion. But what I wanted to sort of direct our attention to was, I think, hearing from CAG members about what does this MOU mean for thinking about future use and remedy implementation at the site. Sounds like Michael,
this is
you want to talk? Okay.
I just
EPA,
want to say that there is an owner of the private property, and it would be good to hear what the owner's expectations for their property is.
We went through
We're
evaluating whether
signatories.
the Mealy Trust was willing to speak to this, right?
The Mealy Trust is the owner of the private portion of the property, and they were and are signers of that memorandum of understanding. So I would presume to say that they're in support of what it contains. I don't believe they're comfortable participating in the CAG, similar to the reasons that the Township of Chatham just listens and doesn't participate. I believe that there is a representative or two from Chatham on the call. I don't think they'll speak. I wish that the Mealy Trust would participate in the CAG, but I can't make them do so.
Juan, do you have more to say on this? Or is that just a clarification?
No, getting the information from the source is I think we all recognize to be the best source, and the fact that they're not here to speak, we're going to discuss things with assumptions being made about what the Mealys want. And, that's something that should be highlighted. We have spoken with the Mealys, and we do speak to them from time to time.
So, okay, I hear what you're saying.
Perhaps we could offline discuss having another meeting between all the parties that signed the MOU and inviting the EPA into that conversation. That would certainly have the Mealys at the table.
So it sounds like it may not make sense for EPA to then weigh in on what this MOU means without the property owner present and part of this conversation. Is that what I'm hearing you say, Juan?
I don't know I don't want to speak for what was on folks' mind to get out of today's discussion.
Yeah.
So I think you should do what you had planned to do. I just wanted to highlight that there is a private owner. There is an owner to the private property. EPA does speak with the Mealys from time to time when it's necessary. And So I just wanted to highlight that for everyone listening.
Okay, that makes sense. So before Mike Horn, I know you're on deck to speak. I do want to kick this back to EPA because I think that part of the last June CAG meeting discussion was really on this topic of how will EPA know if there's a change in sort of intent about future use of this private property. Does an MOU like this change the perspective on what the private portion of the property might be used for? And does that change the sort of anything about the approach that you take at the site risk-wise? And that might not be a question we can talk about right
That's
now.
a
I
question
recognize
posed
that.
to EPA, Matt, is that?
Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah,
question for
broad,
EPA. Yeah.
We don't want to speak about it broadly. Each site is unique and you don't know what the outcome will be.
Yep.
At a particular site. We are aware of the MOU. We have spoken with the Mealies and Fish and Wildlife and the township. And so we've done a lot of work. The bottom line with most of the questions are that we are preparing comments to the draft FS. And once we get those comments in, if they're incorporated, the next step will be to issue our preferred remedy where the public gets a chance to comment. And then there's hopefully a rod at the end of that. That's how the process works. So, you know, the bottom line on these decisions will be known as we move forward with the process. And the next step is the comments to the FS.
Really great non-answer. I'm sorry.
Hey,
Michael,
could I just add a
You're
little
not
bit to that?
entitled to information sooner than we make our decisions. I mean,
Let me put a slightly different piece of information on the table. The MOU was signed. We saw it. We began a process of speaking to a number of the parties who signed it. In addition, a number of other pieces of correspondence were generated out of maybe our discussions and the presence of the MOU itself. And all of that dialogue is relevant to this discussion, not the MOU by itself.
Yep.
And I think one of Juan's points, which I would echo, is we're being careful not to speak for the property owner who has given differing answers to slightly different questions. I'll put it that way. And so it's not just, well, what does EPA think of the MOU anymore?
Mm-hmm.
A lot has happened since that MOU was issued. A lot of other engagement has taken place with us in the township, as Juan said, and with us in the Mealies, with us in the EIP group, with us in Fish and Wildlife Service. And yeah, Sally, maybe the meeting you're suggesting is not such a bad idea.
I will certainly follow up with that.
Well, so I'm going to suggest, based on that comment, that there's so much information that this group is not working with that it's not quite fair to say that this group can really have a substantive conversation about it at this point. I'm curious what CAG members think, though.
I would like to let Mike weigh in on his take on the execution, the drafting and the execution of the MOU, and then ask if the CAG members have
That's fine.
comments as of now. I mean, yeah, there will be more information to come, but it could certainly ask anything they want so far. And I think we may just wind up deferring that second part of this conversation because I don't want to keep people past 8 o'clock. It's not fair.
Fair enough. All right, you're up, Mike.
So Matt, I think you did a really good job of summarizing the MOU. I guess I would add to that in many ways, the development of the MOU was a reaction to the feedback that we had gotten from EPA in previous CAG meetings. We had talked at some length about discussions that were occurring between the refuge and the Mealy Trust and the township and the Watershed Association. But at that time, EPA stated that they really couldn't consider those discussions unless they saw something in writing. And so the MOU started off as an outgrowth of that, as a way to memorialize those discussions and put it on paper so that everybody could see that, there's everybody who signed it, what their intents were as far as the future use of the site and maybe future site development as a passive recreational area. So that's the only thing I would add beyond what you just said, Matt. I think that's kind of gives the context and the reason why. I think another reason why, for me personally, is that we at the refuge constantly are working with our local partners to protect land. And there are some projects in and around the Chatham Township area that were meaningful to various people that we had been talking to. And so it became really evident to me that land protection in Chatham Township it's a big deal, as it should be, as land becomes more and more developed. I think that most people who live in Chatham Township, I think would acknowledge that they appreciate that naturalness that's present in their township. And so that was another kind of impetus behind it was, here we have this landfill that if remediated properly could be a real amenity to all the local residents, all the parties involved. So that's where it came from. It was really a reaction to EPA requesting a memorialization of those discussions among those parties.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, so there's the landfill is in general occupied by two owners. The Fish and Wildlife portion, which is a wilderness area, and we assume will remain the wilderness area. And then the Mealy property, and the Mealys were interested in donating the property to Fish and Wildlife, who is not interested in taking the Mealy portion of the property. So
And if we were in a court of law, that would be objected to as hearsay, right? You can't speak for the Mealys and you can't speak for Fish and Wildlife.
I was in the room when the discussion went on. But I think that misses the greater point that if we're trying to understand what's going on in decision-making, I'm sharing perhaps more than I should about what's going on with the property and why we, may view things in a certain light. So it's an assumption can be made that the Mealys will continue to own the property and intend for it to remain in the condition that it's in.
I don't think that's a reasonable assumption.
Okay.
And I think the MOU speaks to that. But as I mentioned, and John seems to have agreed.
I think you're
perhaps we
right. I
have a
shouldn't
meeting.
have spoken for the Mealys, and perhaps them speaking for themselves would be the best way to go.
Agree.
So my sense is you started a sidebar conversation, Sally, suggesting that maybe, or John, maybe that EPA joining a conversation with parties to the MOU might be a good way to carry this forward. I said earlier that makes me think that there's too much information that this group doesn't have access to now, and people aren't ready to talk about it. So it doesn't feel to me like this is a substantive conversation for CAG members to have, but I'm curious what other people have to say. We got about 5 minutes. Looks like there's a question.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat. As a member of the public, I'm concerned that it appears our two branches of government, EPA and US Fish and Wildlife, don't speak with each other. Does that make sense? We also have a hand raised. Someone might like to speak. Matt, should I give it over to Jeff with his hand raised?
Yep.
All right, go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Grazel. I am a council member for 9 years in Morris Township, mayor for 2 years, currently not on the governing body for the record. I have one comment or piece of information, and I also have a question, maybe a naive question, but let me give you my piece of information first. In Morris Township, we have many old dumps around our town that were local municipal dumps used in the 50s, and they were capped at some point. We had one field called Cornine Field, which is off, which was used as a football field for many, many years with just a dirt covering. And one year somebody started smelling gas and we had to shut down the field. And we ended up capping it and venting it and remediating it with the help of NJDEP and their annual inspections to this day of that field, but it is now capped, has a turf field on it, and is used as a recreational field. But it's an example of something that's been done locally on a smaller scale. It's just one football field. But if that would help anybody in the group, they can get some information from Morris Township about the long process that we went through, the work that we did with NJDEP to bring us to a point where we could actually use that as active recreation. So just wanted to point that out as a project that occurred in the area, not to the scale of what we're looking at here in Chatham Township, but just an example of something that has been done to convert an old dump into something that's usable for recreation. My question, which I think might be a naive question because I'm very new to this on such a large scale, is there any way of doing this project piecemeal? And I'm an engineer, so I'll just throw out an idea, and I know there's probably a clay liner at the bottom, but is there a way of, for example, building a wall to segment off parts of the contaminated area so you could remediate, instead of remediate the whole site at once, but remediate in sections so that you can recapture things piece by piece? Maybe that's a crazy idea, but is that a possibility?
Is there anybody that wants to respond to that? Or is that just a question we can consider in the future?
Hey, Jeff, this is John. I might ask you to take a look at some of the documents available on some of the engineering work that's been done already. And then, I'd be happy to chat with you about it, and maybe we can bring something back to the CAG. But there's a lot of work that's been done already, and so you might have some catching up to do. Let me just put it that way.
Oh, no doubt I have catching up to do, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Good. No, thank you.
As an idea. Great, thank you.
I can give you John's email. You guys can correspond if that's okay.
Yeah, or maybe you and Sally, you and I can catch up first.
Sure.
And Sally, I just wanted to note, and this also will be made available to the public. We're in the process of wrapping up another document, which is essentially it's an evaluation, almost like a miniature FS on that alternative that Fish and Wildlife has been proposing since 2014, 2015. And part of that alternative does involve some type of a slurry wall component. So Jeff, that might be that the document might partially answer your questions, but as soon as we get that finalized, that'll get forward over to Sally, and Sally can share with the group.
Josie and Matt Roby, Matt Palmer has his hand up, and I definitely would like to hear from him before we wrap up.
Yes, I agree. He had it up before.
Let's go to Matt.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody. I just wanted to comment because I think Matt, one of the last things you put out was to hear from the CAG about whether we can comment yet. And I think probably one of the most valuable things I heard was from John saying that a lot of conversations have happened between various parties since the MOU was signed in June. I'm encouraged to hear that that's happened, but until we know more about those conversations and perhaps this new sidebar that Sally suggested about having all of the signatories of the MOU and the EPA sit down, there's not much we can say because it sounds like there are lots of conversations that we're not aware of. I would, want to reiterate, I think what Mike's point was that at our last CAG meeting, we were expressing some interests for future reuse that involved some passive recreation and perhaps greater levels of access and wildlife focused activities, both restoration activities and viewing activities. And I think at the time, the EPA said, well, if there are some goals for the private use of the site that we don't know about, can those be codified? And I thought that's what the MOU did. So I do think that the MOU was a response to the last CAG meeting, some things that came up there. It sounds like now things have happened since, and maybe more needs to happen before we can weigh in again. But I just wanted to comment that as somebody who's not privy to all those conversations and a part of the CAG, I'm a little bit in the dark about where we are at present, but I don't think we're at the same spot that we were at the last CAG meeting because that MOU has been signed and those subsequent conversations have happened. Which is to say, I'm fine tabling this until we, the public, can know more about all these conversations.
I would just like to add that I hope an FS is not imminent that doesn't address those concerns raised in the MOU, since we're not hearing yet what those concerns may be. Josie, it looks like there's a couple more comments in the chat.
Yeah, looks like there's one comment. Josie, you want to read?
Sure. Well, there are two, both from Dot. She notes that transparency is called for here. Why is there not information available why is there information not available to the CAG? And then she also notes that there is nice potential for a trail from Green Village Road near the post office across Rolling Knolls to the existing refuge trail on Myersville Road. Thanks, Dot.
Well, I think everything that EPA has gets put in the public record. We have conversation with the property owners is part of day-to-day business at a site. So I'm a little taken aback that people think that there's information that's not being disclosed. I think the memorandum of understanding is taking on a life of its own, and I'm not sure what folks' expectations are. But there's property owners, and we speak with them. There's the municipal authority that has zoning rights and other rights, and we speak to them, and of course we speak to the community. But the Mealys are the property owner, and they play a big role on what's expected to happen on their property. So, it would be good to hear from them directly.
Just wanted to note that Jeff let us all know that Cornine Field in Morris Township is on Sussex Avenue at the corner of Ingermere Road. If you look at Google Earth, you will see it's adjacent to Winnipeg River. And Dot, would you like to come off of mute and make a comment? I know we don't have much time left here, Matt.
I'd like to hear from Dot.
it's fine if she doesn't feel comfortable coming off of mute.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I have one final segment. I think I covered it at the beginning, but we have our next CAG meeting date picked. So that's going to be March 29th. And the information for that, as we have the meeting materials, Sally will get those out to you all. And I think we can assume that that will, again, be a 6 to 8 p.m. Zoom meeting. Sally, would you say that's what we're planning for?
Yes, much as I would like to go back to in-person, we really get such a great turnout by Zoom that can't justify going back to in-person.
Yep.
So I'll set up the Zoom and send everybody that link, and along with this recording will be, I think, downloaded onto YouTube, and I'll send you the link for that, as well as the presentations from the consultants, GEI, and the PowerPoint from Fish and Wildlife.
Excellent. I think one other topic for that next meeting, which we are going to make space for, is just a brief revisiting of the community advisory group's sort of operating principles. As you know, the group doesn't really have a charter so much as just sort of a set of guidelines of like generally when meetings are held and how we deal with CAG business. And we wanted to just take some time to look at that and make sure it still makes sense for how the CAG is operating and see if there's anything we want to tweak. So that's something that Sally and I were talking about for the next meeting as well.
Hey, Matt, this is Rich Ritchie. I'm counsel to the PRP group. I wanted to just circle back to the point you made at the opening. The PRP group would like the opportunity to speak to the CAG. Certainly, many other stakeholders have been given lots of opportunities to speak to the CAG, and we certainly qualify as stakeholders here. So if you can't fit us on the agenda for the March meeting, we would certainly welcome the opportunity to be put on the agenda for the April meeting. And I promise not to take up too much of your time. And I also promise to try to not waste a lot of time covering things that have been covered ad nauseum throughout the course of this process over how many years we've been doing this. And I hope the CAG will entertain that request favorably.
Thanks, Rich.
Rich, you know I've offered in the past and you had previously declined, which is fine, and you'd like to speak now. And again, as we discussed, I'd just like to know what you wanted to cover, and then I'll email it out to the CAG just to make sure they want to hear it.
Yeah, that's the last part is what concerns me. I mean,
I just like the topic for discussion.
Are you going to take a vote of the CAG as to whether we get to talk? I mean, I'm just trying to understand what the process is.
I'll be discussing something at the CAG at the next meeting, and that may influence their decision one way or the other.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, I was covering my mouth inappropriately. I said I would be discussing something at the next CAG meeting that may or may not determine what they'd like to hear. And I'm happy to have that conversation with you offline. And I'm sure it's not a surprise.
Sure, let's talk.
Okay.
All right. Any last words, anyone? It's nice to see everyone's faces after another 8-month hiatus. I'm glad we have another meeting on the books for next month. So look forward to seeing you then on the 29th.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.